I've now owned my second Canon 5D for about 2.5 years, which is quite considerable really, because the first Canon 5D I only owned it for a couple of weeks because I just didn't get on with it. I found that the camera was all too quick to blow out the highlights, and yeah, I just got rid of it. But I did eventually buy another one, and I think based on my experiences with this one, in that it doesn't blow out the highlights quite as easily, and I still dial in a bit of underexposure, and then on the back of the screen as well, after I take a shot, I'll check the blinkies and the histogram to make sure that I exposed it correctly. And touch wood, that seems to do all right for me. So that kind of makes me think that the first Canon 5D I tried was faulty. I'll put a link up to the original video I made on the Canon 5D in general, but obviously I will do a follow-up video with this, although this video will kind of be a follow-up video, because even though I'll come to talk about it in a minute, I was hoping the Lumix S1 would almost feel like a more modern Canon 5D to use, with some more modern benefits. It hasn't really worked out that way. So as you might gather, because I've had this camera now for 2.5 years, it's pretty much a firm fixture in my camera collection, although it isn't without its frustrations. Like, I do find it to be a struggle to get sharp shots with it consistently, but that's probably my fault really, in that I'll take a shot, when I get home it's out of focus or it's blurry, and I'm thinking, oh, why's that happen? But then I'll look and see that the shutter speed was too low probably for the camera to correctly capture a sharp shot. And that's generally because this camera doesn't have auto ISO. You have to select the ISO manually, so that's something that you've got to remember to do. And then it hasn't got like an auto minimum shutter speed selection that you can dial in. So like on my Fuji X-E1 cameras, like this one here, I find the implementation of auto ISO and minimum shutter speed to be absolutely brilliant. I rarely get an out of focus shot with this, and if I do, it's something that I've done wrong or I've moved. But yeah, I find that this has been the best implementation I've found on the camera for getting sharp shots, sufficiently sharp shots, whilst preserving a high enough shutter speed or upping the ISO if needed to ensure that occurs. Another issue I find as well with the Canon 5D and with other full frame cameras, to be honest, that I've tried, is that I'd love using vintage lenses on my cameras. I love the special character that they bring to images sometimes, and I try to replicate that with the Canon 5D, because obviously there's benefits of using vintage lenses on full frame cameras. So I tried with the normal screen, the normal focusing screen in the Canon 5D, but rarely do I get a sharp manual focus shot with the Canon 5D. And I even hunted down a special focusing screen to go into the Canon 5D. It's called an EES focusing screen, and it's like a matte screen. So the idea being that when you manually focus, you'll get more of a clear indication of when your subject is in focus. So I persevered with that for a while, but no matter what I tried, I just cannot seem to use manual focus lenses that well on here unless I'm happy with out of focus shots. So that's pretty much my frustrations I find with using the Canon 5D. But saying that, the reason why I've still kept it is that if you do manage to nail exposure, you manage to set the correct ISO, and the camera picks a shutter speed to help you capture a sharp shot, then the output that this camera produces is nothing short of amazing, even with the rubbishy lenses that I've got for it. Like, I've got a couple cheapo zooms, and for some reason the images that I get out of them they just surpass anything that I've attempted to get out when using newer full frame cameras. It's just something about it, the sensor, the various filters on that sensor, it just seems to produce some really magical images. And I think it even does a better job than the Fuji XE1 and the X-Trans 1 sensor cameras, because whilst it does have a special look to its images, I find that the auto white balance on the 5D just brings a natural affinity to the renderings of the images that it produces. And yeah, I like both cameras, but yeah, the Canon 5D is something special. It feels great in the hand, it's simple to use, it's not overly complicated. The information that the screen gives you is just great to check your settings. And like I said, great OVF, no IBIS as well, so that's why it's important just to have a decent shutter speed. What if you could get a similar full frame camera which produced similar results but had more modern features that it could bring to the table, such as more resolution, a more modern autofocus system? Like, I generally just rely on the central point in the Canon 5D and then half press and recompose, and that's all I pretty much use. But obviously more modern digital cameras have a much more sophisticated autofocus system, so that would be quite handy, especially if it had some face detection ability as well, to make sure that you do get those subjects sharp in focus. It would be nice as well for a camera to have IBIS, so that you could have a lower shutter speed in order to get a lower ISO and obviously a more cleaner image. And it'd be great as well if you could have an amazing electronic viewfinder with lots of information, and then manual focusing aids, modern manual focusing aids like magnification, picture in picture and focus peaking, to help you capitalize on using vintage manual focus lenses and be able to actually more easily capture great looking images, great looking sharp images with those old lenses. So enter the Panasonic Lumix S1, which is this beast of a camera here. And it's funny, I always tried, when I was looking for full frame cameras to try, I always looked for cameras which were smaller and lighter. Coming from Micro Four Thirds, the thought of getting a camera that weighed over a kilogram at the time was, I just didn't even appear on my radar, to be honest, because it's such a big camera. As you can probably see, it's a similar size to the Canon 5D, and it's actually a little bit heavier. But saying that, it's not as bad as I feared, to be honest. I think knowing that what on paper it has inside of it, you could overlook you can understand the size and the weight of the Panasonic Lumix 1. Hopefully more capable, right? So like I said, on paper, this seems to tick a lot of boxes. Like I said, it's not as big as or as heavy as I expected. It, because of the grip on the front, it feels great in the hand. Like, the build quality is like built like a tank, this thing. I feel like if I hear a home invader, this is the camera I'm going to reach for, because I feel that it would take anything down and it would survive a lot of abuse before you could see it. And actually this version that I picked up last week has had a bit of a hard life. It's got a shutter count of about 70,000. There's marks on the sensor, and it's missing a couple caps here and there, some scratches on the screen, and it's got this ginormous eye cup accessory on the back, which I'm sure some people might like, but it's far too big for my liking. But anyway, getting back to the specs of this camera just briefly, and why I decided to go for it in the first place. It has a modern autofocus system, supposedly. It has this great three-way tilting screen that I absolutely loved on Fujifilm cameras. So it has the normal tilting mechanism where you can do that but then it also has the button where you can tilt it in that orientation as well for low level shots, which is great. And I used to be totally against fully articulating screens because I wasn't into video before I started my channel, but now I can definitely see the benefits of having a fully articulating screen. Like, I have tried a video with this camera, but it is nice to be able to see you in order to frame your video a little bit better, and to check that you're in focus and that it's recording. That feedback by having a monitor is great. But anyway, back to the S1. So yeah, it's got a great screen for photography, and the EVF, man, this EVF is absolutely amazing. It's large, so it's a 1/2 inch size EVF, and it's got about 5.8 million dots, which is pretty impressive, as well as it's having picture-in-picture magnification and focus peaking to help you nail, in theory, those manual focus type shots that I am hoping, or I hope that it would help me to more easily achieve. It's also got great custom banks, but I'll talk about those a little bit later. And like I said, this one's got an LCD screen as well, and it's also, if you light it up, you probably can't see it, but it's also got light up buttons as well to help you compose when you're out in the field. I'm not sure whether that's gonna show, but trust me, it has got them. Spoiler alert, but I'm not keeping the S1, and I'm probably going to return it to CX pretty soon, because I think this camera has got a fault. Like, I don't know whether you can see that on the screen now, but every once in a while it will tell me to turn the camera off and then on again. So not great when you actually want to come to use it. Sometimes it clears, sometimes it doesn't. So I thought, on paper, doing some research, this was the camera that was going to do it all for me, barring like moving subjects. Like, I knew that this wasn't going to be a speed demon, but I was hoping that it might have been just good enough so I could have just had this camera and be done with anything else. But unfortunately, that is not to be, as I will go into. So what went wrong, and what don't I like about this S1? So let's talk about the image quality. I was hoping it would produce similar results to the Canon 5D, and I even did some comparisons with the Fujifilm X1 as well, because there's the 5D and the X1 are probably the cameras that I use which give me some really special looking results without too much editing in post. But I found that the image quality, the output, it was quite flat and boring. And I know it's got some image profiles in there which then are into Lightroom to allow you to use them to find a starting position, but I've tried them all, and to be honest, just some presets that I have in Lightroom that I've developed over the years, so I just use those, and it just instantly with the raw file produces a much nicer output for me from the raw file. So yeah, so I'm not a massive fan. Whereas you contrast that with the Fujifilm X1 and the 5D, I literally do not have to do much editing in post to get those image files how I want them to look. Right, so the next big disappointment was its manual focus aids, or its ability for me to capture sharp images using my manual focus lenses. And I'm starting to realise that using old vintage manual focus lenses is difficult, whether you've got manual focus aids or not. But I think the problem with this camera is that when I was using the manual focusing aids, it was showing me on the back of the screen or in the EVF that if I took the shot, then I would get a sharp image. But when I got the results back home and looked at them, I was really disappointed, because when I was out using the camera in the field, it felt absolutely great. It felt like it was really delivering the results. The aids were working as I'd hoped they worked. The EVF is just an amazing camera to use out in the field, but then I was just bitterly disappointed when the results at home didn't marry up to what I was experiencing out in the field. And it's even more compounded by the fact that I was using manual focus lenses on the Fuji X1 and also using 35mm f1.4 as well, because obviously this is a full frame camera, so obviously I do quite like that full frame look sometimes, but to be honest, I found that the Fujifilm was giving me, and then when I went out with the Canon 5D, I just found that those cameras gave me more interesting, characterful images than the ones that I managed to achieve from the Lumix S1. That's why I love using the Fujifilm X1. Okay, the EVF is absolutely tiny. The focus peaking implementation is extremely basic, and it's got no IBIS, but for some reason, and like when I've been out with this, the IBIS is great. You can look through the viewfinder and your composition is so steady, there's no shake there. But then when I'm trying to take the same shot with the XE1, and I can see the screen like waving, with just holding it up trying to take the shot, but for some reason the images just come out sharp, whereas they didn't with the lenses I was using on the Lumix S1. Even when I tried stopping the aperture down as well, so getting away from that sometimes glowy wide open look and stopping it down to f4, f5.6, I was still struggling with the S1 to get sharp shots with manual focus. So yeah, it was so frustrating when I could see on the screen that the image was going to be sharp, and then it just wasn't when I brought it home and looked at it on the computer. Right, so this isn't necessarily a problem limited to the Lumix S1, but I've started to really question the ability of modern cameras with AI autofocus and deep learning algorithms to actually get what you want in focus. Don't get me wrong, and again, this is probably just my usage. Like, my dog is probably a really difficult subject to photograph because she's small and dark, but then I've had success with Fuji and Olympus cameras in the past, so it's been really frustrating for me trying like the Sony A9, the Canon R8, and seeing the camera detect the subject, but then actually when reviewing the results, seeing that the focus was off. That's just, yeah. So I just feel where I am in my journey at the moment that I'm not going to be giving any cameras with AI a go until that technology has matured a little bit, because whilst they seem to be very good at detecting subjects, like this one, when I was taking pictures of my wife, it was showing like the green box with the lines which intersect where the eyes were, but then when you get them back onto the computer, it's missed the focus. And then this was the case as well when she was taking pictures of me and my glasses. It was focusing on the glasses rather than my eye. And yeah, so I'm not a massive fan at the moment for my needs of the AI deep learning subject detection functionality. Hopefully in a few years' time, when then that technology has matured, the hit rate for my needs will be more accurate. But at the moment, I'm going to give them a bit of a wide berth, and it's one of the reasons why I like the only full frame mirrorless cameras that I haven't tried so far is Nikon, but I think I'm just going to be just as disappointed as I was with the Canon R8 and the A9 before it. Yeah, so like I said, this has like AI face detect, animal human detects up the yin yang, and it seemed to be working in some instances, especially for like static, like human subjects which didn't move a lot, but then looking at the results, it told a different, more inconsistent story. This leads me on to my next point as well, and like I said earlier, I was not expecting this camera to be great at sports or capturing my dog like running towards me or out running in the field, but the actual experience was worse than I had anticipated, especially because this apparently does have animal autofocus, but certainly from my experience, it was just a waste of time. No matter what techniques, what settings, what autofocus sensitivities I dialed in, whether I used the burst modes, whether I used the 6K photo mode. I just did not get any usable shots. And the main problems were that my dog didn't really get detected in the frame until she was really close. I also tried turning that off as well to try and just track her like a normal camera would, and still the hit rate was poor. It just didn't seem to pick her up in the frame. And even though I tested it at home, you know, when you've got multiple subjects in the frame, you can click on the joystick button on the back of the camera, and that I did see it back in the office looking at some pictures on the screen. That was moving the focus box, so you could focus on your subject. But if you've got an animal and a human in the same frame, I just found that it just would not select the animal. It just always defaulted to the human in the frame, and it didn't even pick up my dog half the time. So yeah, so even though, like I said, I wasn't expecting this to do that well, I was expecting it to do better than it did. Yeah, so again, on the back of the autofocus of this camera, it's got a pitiful 6 frames per second mechanical shutter, and I've got to say the rolling shutter is the worst I've ever seen. Like, and I've owned the Fujifilm X-H1, which was pretty bad, but this was pretty terrible, with obvious distortion of my dog quite visible in the scene. This is probably my last L-mount camera that I'm going to buy, which is a real shame because I was really looking forward to buying the Lumix 20 to 60mm kit lens, because it's like weather sealed and it covers a really good range of focal lengths. And for my time with it, certainly for like non-moving subjects, it's been absolutely great. But I'm not going to have the camera anymore, so the lens is obviously going to go back as well. So let's talk about the custom settings as well, because whilst I appreciate the camera having custom settings, they're not quite as good as, say, on my Olympus cameras, where I literally just have to select C1, C2, C3, and away you go. But it's not quite straightforward with the Lumix. You've got to dial in the C mode that you want. Hopefully it does show you can rename them, which I think is really good, because so you can have one of like action, manual focus, video, etc. I think it's really useful to have that, so they display on the screen. But what you've got to remember to do, so say you I want to switch to an action, you've got to change to the correct custom mode. Then you've got to change the burst mode selector here from single shot to burst mode 1 or 2. And then you've also got to change this button here from single autofocus to continuous autofocus. That's a lot to remember, and certainly in the field I was like trying to click a burst and then wondering why it only took one shot. It should perhaps give you the option to override the physical dials, so you don't have to change more than one thing. One thing I didn't expect to see with this camera though is lag in the EVF. Like, the first time I went out, the light wasn't brilliant and then it was getting dark. And when I was looking around composing shots, there was a lot of lag, a lot more lag in the EVF than I was anticipating. And I know you've got live view boost modes in the camera, which would help, but then that would distort what you're seeing, what you get view in the EVF. Right, so that's the main things that I didn't like with my short time that I've had the Lumix S1. So was there anything other than the points I've already mentioned that I did quite like about the camera? As long as your subject is not moving, like landscapes or static subjects with like the 20 to 60 lens, for instance, I produced sharp shots, great sharp shots, which I can produce, unfortunately, with my other cameras as well. So I wasn't really gaining anything by keeping the S1 just for those types of shots. But like I said earlier, with the Canon 5D, even with like the cheap 28 to 105, I think I paid 50 quid for it. It gives me real good three-dimensionality to my images that just make you just stand back in awe really about the quality that camera can and does produce. So I used it a couple of times as well. Like, I assigned the ability to change the crop of your picture to a front function button. So in particular with this camera, you can actually choose the X-Pan crop. So that was really cool to use to compose the scene. And then when you're back in Lightroom, you've got the full raw 3:2 image, but it shows up with the crop that you captured out in the field. So I think that's a really good benefit and feature to have. Although it doesn't preclude you from just taking a shot out in the field with X-Pan in mind and then just applying the crop laterally in post anyway, as I have done in the past. As I touched on briefly earlier as well, as long as the human subjects don't move that much and they don't wear glasses or face covering, I did find that the face detection did do a reasonable job. It's just a shame that it still was a little bit inconsistent for me, and more so than what I can achieve with my other cameras. Another benefit of this camera, and I'll try and get you to hear it now as well, is the sound of the mechanical shutter. It's probably up there with the best I've heard. Probably the next closest is probably the Fujifilm X-H1, which had a great shutter sound as well. Yeah, it sounds great. You compare that to the sound of the mighty Canon 5D, quite a big difference. I touched on it briefly as well. Like I said, the EVF is absolutely a sight to behold. The best one I tried again before this was probably on the Fujifilm X-H1. So that wraps up what I don't like, what I like about this camera. So I'll just wrap this up now with some conclusions. So even though I haven't had this camera that long, like less than a week, compared to other cameras, it does feel familiar because I have used Panasonic Micro Four Thirds cameras and it's easy to set up. The menus are very intuitive. As I said, you can customize it, and I did customize it to the 9th degree before I actually used it, and then I used it and then I customized it some more to try and better match what I wanted to get out of it. And as I said, I went out, I thoroughly tested it, I tried some different things, I came back, I did some research, tweaked a few of the settings, went out, tested, did again. So I've used this camera, even though I've only owned this camera for a week, it feels very familiar, and I feel like I've tested every combination that I think I could test in order to get better results out of it. But when I just take along my Canon 5D and my Fuji X1 and they deliver the goods, it really makes me question what this is adding to my collection, and it doesn't add anything. Perhaps other than more resolution for landscape type shots, but then I'm sure this isn't the last camera that I'm going to try and experiment with that can do that. Like I said, hopefully you can probably tell how disappointed I am with this camera. I really thought it was going to deliver what I wanted it to deliver. It feels great in the hands. Like I said, it feels like it's delivering the results, and as long as you're just using normal lenses, autofocus lenses, and not focusing on anything that moves and just more static landscape type shots, then that's great. But it's not what I bought this camera for, and it has not delivered on those aspects for me. On the plus side though, it's definitely rekindled my love for the Canon 5D and the Fuji X1, and it's actually made me think actually that maybe I should give Fujifilm another go next time around and see what like an X-T3 or an X-T4 could add. As when I've used the X-H1 in the past, I've certainly been impressed with the image quality once you get beyond the difficulties you have with its X-Trans sensor. Certainly when I was using the X-E1 as well, even though this is a 16 meg sensor camera, I'm always amazed at the amount of detail that this sensor and camera combination can extract from a scene. So what I have come to realize is that I just struggle so much with manually focusing vintage lenses on full frame cameras. Like I've tried them on the Sony A7S, the Sony A9, the Canon 5D, the Canon R8, and now the Lumix S1, and my hit rate is just abysmal, and I just feel that like maybe I'm just not going to go for another full frame camera, because I never have the same difficulty when I've used them on my crop sensor cameras. And so maybe that is the problem. You know, maybe it is more difficult to use full frame cameras, and maybe it's more difficult to use them for manual focus lenses, or maybe even it's better to go for more modern manual focus lenses like the ones from Voigtlander, which are more designed for digital cameras rather than trying to use lenses which were designed for film cameras. Because that's another thing as well, I don't seem to have the trouble using those vintage lenses on my film cameras. I don't seem to have issues with focus when using film cameras. So maybe there is something there in that I do just struggle using them on digital full frame cameras. So just a final word, I feel like, as I touched on again, the Lumix S1 marks the end of my full frame adventures since going down the rabbit hole, probably the tail end of 2022 when I bought the Sony A7S, which I absolutely loved for using manual focus lenses with, but I never got them in focus. They look nice, but I never got them in focus. And then that started me off down the rabbit hole of full frame cameras, hoping that they would replace my Olympus Micro Four Thirds and Fujifilm cameras, but that just hasn't really transpired. So that's it. As I said, the Lumix S1, the 2060, and then the manual focus adapter that I got for some of my lenses will be being returned, and that's the end of the Lumix S1. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.